As the trachea descends toward the diaphragm, it branches into the two primary bronchi. We have the right, and here we have the left. The left bronchus is ever so slightly, just a little bit higher than the right bronchus, and it's making room for the heart. In fact, when foreign objects are swallowed, they're more likely to go into the left bronchus because it's the first one they encounter. So the primary bronchi, they pierce the lung tissue, and then they branch into secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and so forth. The trachea and the primary bronchi are some of the highest areas of resistance to airflow through that conducting system, and therefore they have the ability to limit the gas exchange that happens further in the lung. Conditions like bronchitis and asthma cause bronchoconstriction, and they affect the trachea and the primary bronchi, and they substantially increase the resistance to airflow through these tubes. Many people, both child and adult, who suffer from asthma have lungs that operate perfectly fine. The problem is getting the air to the bronchi and to the lungs. Many of us are familiar with the condition of bronchitis. It can be caused by an infectious agent, usually bacterial, but it can also be caused by an oversympathetic response. No matter what the cause, bronchoconstriction by the smooth muscle of the trachea and primary bronchi, they cause a considerable decrease in airflow to the lungs, and therefore they also cause a considerable amount of resistance. Often, accompanying bronchoconstriction is an increased mucus production by those mucus cells that are scattered in the epithelium lining these tubes. This decreases the diameter of the bronchi and the trachea even more, right? So you've got bronchoconstriction, and you can see the smooth muscle squeezing this tube here. And then you also have mucus production, and all of it is just reducing that little tiny diameter there. Bronchitis causes inflammation of the primary bronchi and trachea. Pollutants can also trigger bronchoconstriction. And there are many people who are hoarders who experience asthma related to pollutants triggering their bronchoconstriction and mucus production. So I guess the lesson here is to both humidify and filter your air if you have asthma. I suspect you would need well, I have two things that I use too. A humidifier is right here to my left, and then there's an air filter out there. Medications that treat these conditions, they all focus on causing bronchodilation. Albuterol is the active agent in most inhalers, and epinephrine is usually an active agent in nebulizer treatments. Both albuterol and epinephrine attach to receptors on the bronchi and trachea that are part of the sympathetic nervous system. So what this does, these two medications, they actually simulate a fight or flight response from just these organs, trachea and bronchi, causing bronchodilation, right? Because remember, if you are running away from a threat, your trachea and bronchi will dilate to allow you to have more air entry. And so these medications cause a sympathetic response, which would then reverse that bronchodilation that they're experiencing. Can I say I've only had a nebulizer treatment once, but yeah, like after it, you feel like I felt like awesome. I was like, yeah, because it's a huge epinephrine rush. Secondary bronchi branch off of the primary bronchi. I appreciate their alternate name. The alternate name of secondary bronchi is lobar bronchi. And this name indicates how secondary bronchi each lead to one of the lobes of the lung that they serve. There are three secondary bronchi over here on the right lung because there are three lobes of that lung. Over on the left, which I don't have pictured here, but we know that over on the left, there would be two secondary bronchi because there are only two lobes of the left lung, giving the heart a little space to occupy. Coming off the secondary bronchi are tertiary bronchi. Of course, I prefer their alternate name, segmental bronchi, because this name indicates that each segmental bronchus serves one segment of a lung. And as we'll later see, we like to think of the lung in these sections that are called bronchopulmonary segments. They're segments that all inflate or deflate at the same time, right? And this is why tertiary bronchi are really a focus of a lot of research of pulmonologists, right? Because it is these tertiary bronchi that really determine if a large part of the lung is going to inflate. At the microscopic level, tertiary and secondary bronchi are suspended among alveoli or the dead end sacs of the lungs. The mucosa of bronchioles is usually wavy, as in this picture that I have here, right? That's wavy. And then this and this are also bronchioles with their wavy mucosa. So these are running throughout the lung, right? And kind of running with their companion capillaries, arteries, and veins. As air travels from the nasal cavity through the pharynx, through the trachea, through the primary, secondary bronchi, the respiratory mucosa, it transitions from this pseudostratified ciliated columnar cells into more of just a simple columnar. And then as we go even further, it transitions into like simple cuboidal cells with some cilia. Not a lot, not as much, but some. So as you travel through the conducting system, the epithelium changes, but there's also fewer mucus cells scattered among the epithelium. We need mucus less and less as we traverse toward the alveoli. At some point that is not well defined, bronchi transition into bronchioles. I'm kidding. There's a certain point. We just don't need to know the measurement for our class here. Bronchioles are much smaller, but there are so many of them that cumulatively, bronchioles do not produce any air resistance to airflow. This is exactly the opposite of what we saw in blood vessels. Let me say that again. This is exactly the opposite of what we saw in blood vessels, right? Arterioles were really tiny, but there were not very many of them, and so they provided a lot of resistance. Bronchioles here are also really tiny, but there's so many of them that they have no resistance. As air moves further and further into the lungs, passing branches of bronchi and bronchioles, gases come to an area of very little resistance, much less airflow, and more of an opportunity to exchange gases through membranes. A terminal bronchiole, which is this right here, which is also this right here, a terminal bronchiole is not the last bronchiole that air will move through before getting into the alveolar clusters, which are like the dead end cul-de-sacs of the lung. A terminal bronchiole is more like a highway. And coming off of this highway are respiratory bronchioles. So, like this one, this one, this one, this one. And I have a few respiratory bronchioles over here as well. I guess at this point I should mention that there are close to 3 million alveolar clusters in your lungs. So this one picture here is, definitely not showing you the magnitude to which these structures belong. Terminal bronchioles have no mucus cells and a very simple cuboidal lining, maybe even simple squamous. The smooth muscle becomes less, almost non-existent, and less prevalent around the bronchioles as we head toward these alveolar clusters, right? We're getting to a point where we can exchange gases through these structures. There are some elastic fibers that slash over these alveolar clusters, but they're not as many as there were supporting terminal and respiratory bronchioles as there are supporting the alveoli. The respiratory bronchioles lead directly to a cluster or an alveolar cluster. There is no smooth muscle, there are very few elastic fibers, and the alveolar clusters are made up of or lined with simple squamous cells, very, very flat, through which gas exchange can happen. The gas exchange ability is the dividing line between the conducting system and the respiratory system, right? It's the dividing line between the system of tubes that's solely concerned with airflow and then the system of respiratory structures that are solely concerned with gas exchange. This is why respiratory bronchioles, they get their name respiratory and not terminal. They are the first place where oxygen can diffuse into blood vessels and carbon dioxide can diffuse out of the blood vessels.